Every bike is made up of consumable parts. You've got your chain, your cassette, brake pads, and even your gear cables. But how do you know when to replace them? Well, stay tuned. I'm going to show you some tips and tricks so that you know for sure. Sadly, all of that pad is not for use. If your pads sit in clips, then those clips hold on to the pad itself. So if you run it really close to that clip, you could even wear the clip away and then your pads will just fall out of the calipers. If you don't have clips, like Magura for example, which is held in by magnets, then running it really close to the bare metal means you might even damage the discs and you'll have to replace them as well. Also, bear in mind that the thinner the pads, the more your calipers will have to move in, and that means the levers on your brakes will come really close to the handlebars. You might not even get enough power to stop. If your pads are held in by clips, then you want at least 1 millimeter to spare. SRAM suggests that it's 3 millimeters in total from the back plate, and Magura say don't go past anything less than 2.5. Also, don't forget to remember that organic will wear away much faster than sintered, so you might want to get some spares a little sooner. Your disc rotors will wear away over time. If you can feel an indent, it's probably a key sign you've gone a little too far already. Shimano recommend that you replace your discs when they're 1.5 millimeters wide or less. For SRAM, they will have the minimum widths written on the discs, as I've got here with 1.7 millimeters. So if it's that or less, you need to replace them. With anything else, like Magura, for example, you need to check your manual where it should say the minimum width that they should be. Otherwise, check to see what width they were originally and replace them when they're anything more than 0.3 millimeters less than they were originally. Another thing to look out for is any scratches or scores. Sometimes you can get stones in there which will scratch the rotor and create big grooves, and that's a good time to replace them, as well as they'll just eventually damage all of the pads that you put in your calipers as well. Now, you can actually get those resurfaced sometimes by a professional or with a fine grade of sandpaper. But anytime you replace your discs, it's a good idea to replace your pads at the same time too. Often we hear the phrase chain stretch used when we talk about a chain wearing out. Now, a chain doesn't technically stretch, but those rollers will wear tiny little gaps into every link. And under tension, as that chain falls into each of those little gaps, the overall length of that chain will actually grow. It's that chain growth that causes the cassette and the front chain ring to wear, because they're supposed to perfectly mesh, but if the chain is longer, then it'll wear out grooves into the more expensive parts, like the cassette and the front chain ring. And that's why we replace the chain on a regular basis, ideally before it is grown, so that we can catch it before it's worn out those other parts. My favorite method of checking whether the chain has stretched or not is to use a chain check-in device. And you'll see measurements on them like 0.25 or 0.75, and that is working out the percentage in which it has grown. For 12 speed, you want to replace it at about 0.25. 11 speed, you can get away with 0.5, and anything less than that, like 10 or 9, you can get away with it being 0.75. So this is the Park Tool CC2, which is great for 12 speed because it has that 0.2 measurement on it. And all you do with this sort is you drop it into the pins and you squeeze it until there's a little bit of resistance, and that reading will tell you how much it has grown by. So a solid chain checker like this, you'll just need to get the curved section into a roller and just drop it in. And as you can see, it's not dropping all the way in, so it's not level with the top of the reader, which means it's not stretched to that amount. Now, if you don't have a chain checker, although I recommend you getting one because it could actually save you money in the long run, in the meantime, you can actually use a ruler. So every link in a chain is exactly ½ inch long. So if you were to get the beginning of the ruler to one link and follow it all the way along, if it starts to get out of whack, then it means that chain has grown. 1/116th at the end is a 0.5% chain growth. So you know that you're going to need to replace it if it starts to get that much out of whack. Little bonus method for you here, and this isn't super accurate, but it is a good checker if you're out on the trail, is to pull one of your links from the front chainring. Now there shouldn't be much movement there at all, and if you can completely pull it off a tooth, it definitely needs changing. In fact, you've probably gone past the point and might need to change your whole drivetrain. As your chain stretches or gets longer, it'll no longer mesh perfectly with your cassette. And because it gets longer and it's not meshing properly, it'll actually wear grooves into your cassette. And that's why it's a good idea to keep on top of changing your chain regularly so that it doesn't wear out this expensive replaceable part. Once it has worn out, you'll know because your gears won't be working as crisply when you put a new chain on. So if you put a new chain on and everything starts to click or change slowly, then it's probably a good indicator that you need to replace your cassette. Now you've got two options here. You've put a new chain on and your cassette isn't working very well, so you're going to need to replace that anyway. If you want to save a little bit of money, you can put the old chain back on and run that old cassette until you can't bear the gears not working properly anymore, and then put the new one on. Otherwise, if money's no object, then you might as well put that new cassette on with your new chain and get super crisp gear changes straight away. Now, assuming there's no damage or bends or kinks to your cables, it's pretty hard to know whether they need replacing just by looking at them. But generally, if your drivetrain is in good working order, your cassette and your chain is good, but your gears aren't changing very nicely, then it might be time for a new inner cable at very least. You'll know because your levers are starting to get stiff. And over time, your inner cable and your outer cable might start to bind or rust a bit over time with some water ingress. So squirting a bit of MO94 down the outer cable can prolong its life, but if it's binding too much, then it's probably time to replace that outer cable as well. Now, it's hard to put a time or a mileage on when you need to replace tyres because no one rider is the same. Someone who's riding rough, rocky terrain or even just riding really aggressively might go through tyres a lot quicker than someone else. Generally, if you start to round off the knobs here or you start to see them wear away, then your grip is going to lessen. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to replace them, but if you do, then your traction and your grip will be much better. If you have punctures, holes and splits in the sidewall, this will obviously reduce the reliability of your tyre. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to replace them. You can still roll if you don't want to buy some new ones. If you start to see any fibres or wires coming through in your tyre, or if you start to lose the knobs on the outside here, then that's probably a sure sign that you're going to need to replace them soon. You'll usually find bearings in places like your headset, your bottom bracket, and even your pivots if you have a full suspension. You'll know they'll need replacing or at least servicing when things start to get a bit grindy. With the headset, if you apply your front brake and turn your handlebars and you rock it forwards and backwards, you can usually feel it knocking or even sounds like it's knocking even when everything's done up tightly. With your bottom bracket, you can actually hold the rear chainstay and pedal backwards. And if you feel a bit of a grinding feeling through the chainstay, that's probably a good indicator that your bottom bracket is at least a little bit dry. With your rear suspension pivots, if you can put it in a work stand, take your wheel out and move your suspension freely, perhaps with no air in your rear shock, it should feel nice and smooth. But if it doesn't move freely or if it gets stuck in one position, that's a good indicator that you need to replace those suspension pivots. Now you can service pretty much all bearings. You can at least put some grease in there so that they start to run more freely. But in my experience, once you've removed that little seal, it becomes much easier for water to get in and generally wear out the ball bearings themselves. So I would start to think about replacing that once you've serviced them anyway. Well, hopefully that's helped you keep on top of all the replaceable parts on your mountain bike. But if you've got any handy tips of your own, do let us know down in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more helpful videos like this in the future. Thanks for watching.